Good evening or good afternoon in Canada. I'm happy to welcome Professor Arel from the University of Ottawa. Thank you for being here. ICEUR is conducting interviews with leading experts in Ukraine and Russia. So you are an associate professor of political science and chair of Ukraine studies at the University of Ottawa. And you specialize in identity politics and nationalism in Eastern Europe. At the moment, Russia is invading Ukraine. Intense fighting is continuing all over the country, and the situation regarding reliable information is continuing to be difficult. So how do you assess the current situation on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, obviously the situation on the ground is dramatic, and we see the images. Essentially, Russia is resorting to conducting siege of major cities, Kharkiv, Mariupol in Donbass, Sumy in northern Ukraine, and ultimately Kiev, although for now the bombing in Kiev has been in the suburbs, so the city has not been yet fully encircled. And it's basically indiscriminate attacks. We see that in real time on TV, on social media. Apartment buildings, apparently 400 of them in Kharkiv alone. Kharkiv is the second major city in Ukraine. Maternity wards, like this morning in Mariupol. Schools. It's basically indiscriminate bombing to terrorize the population into submission. But the Ukrainian resistance, the military resistance and the civil fortitude has been extraordinarily impressive. So we have a very dire situation, and yet the Russian army has not been able to achieve its objectives, certainly not in the timeline that most obviously President Putin had initially.
Thank you very much. So many Western military analysts are currently saying that Putin has probably overestimated the Russian military capacities and that the war is not going as he initially thought it would. So what would you say are Putin's goals in this war currently?
Well, the announced goal, using, of course, extremely strange, if not very offensive language, was to, as he put it, demilitarize Ukraine. So it's kind of the extreme policy of neutralizing the so-called or alleged security threat, certainly from the Russian perspective, of NATO, of Ukraine one day joining NATO, and that Russia would be would be threatened by a neighbor immediately. Ukraine. So if you basically intend as a goal to destroy the military force of Ukraine, then there you go. Ukraine can never join NATO because it won't even have an army. So that was the first stated goal, which so far has not been achieved because the Ukrainian military, its losses in the big picture remain I wouldn't say minimal, but the army is standing, and even its air force 2 weeks into the conflict. But the second goal, and that's the very offensive part, the so-called denazification, which for the rest of the world is a very strange objective to go to war. If you decode it, meant essentially to overthrow the government and eliminate the entire political class that is seen as anti-Russian. Well, that goal obviously has not been achieved, but in the worst case analysis, a lot of people could get arrested if Russia manages to break cities into submission down the road.
Well, at the moment, the West seems to be quite unified, and especially the European Union. It's a different picture than we saw a few months ago. So how could a new security architecture in Europe look like in regards to the roles of EU and NATO?
Yes, it would seem that Putin banked on the disunity or the divisions within the alliances, the alliance, particularly within NATO, but also between EU states. And there's obviously a great deal of overlap between the two organizations. And it has been very impressive that we haven't seen that disunity at all. With the possible exception now, as the moment that we're speaking, the United States have announced a ban on the export of Russian oil and gas. In Canada, also from where I'm speaking from, also announced that, but not in Britain as well, but not the European Union. Because obviously the EU states, and in particular Germany, would be the most affected very short term with such a drastic decisions, which could happen because basically all the guardrails or all we didn't expect Germany in particular to let go of Nord Stream 2 so fast in the conflict. Was basically day one, even before Putin officially launched the war. It's after we recognized the so-called republics of Donbass. So this has been very impressive. In terms of a new architecture, what we're seeing is a realization by member states. Germany announced it, Denmark announced it, and it's basically the domino all falling, that there will be a military buildup in Europe, recognizing that Russia is actually causing an existential threat to Europe, if not to the world, but certainly it's not the war in Ukraine is the first war of aggression on European soil since 1939 to 1941, since Germany invaded and destroyed Poland in 1939, and then we know what happened next, including the invasion of the Soviet Union. That in itself is such a breach of international order. It's one thing that was bad enough to annex Crimea, one small province, however strategically important, in 2014. It's another to launch a full-scale war on Ukraine. So we see that then in a sense, the remilitarization of NATO. But it's just hard to imagine any kind of geopolitical sustainable compromise involving Ukraine here regarding Russia, because Russia has demonstrating to our very eyes that its ultimate intent is to destroy the sovereignty of Ukraine. So it is so extreme that any kind of new lasting situation, it would seem to me, would probably resemble what's happening in the Middle East between Israel and Arab states, and kind of in a sense of permanent cold warfare and between Ukraine and Russia, and with the support of NATO in some kind of security arrangement, probably short of including officially Ukraine within NATO, but kinds of security guarantees. But it's very difficult to plan anything now, even to think ahead in the midst of the destruction that we're facing. But Russia, we can talk about, I'm sure you'll have a question on identity terms, because there's something very, very, very profound happening now between Russia and Ukraine beyond the bombs. But on security matters, Russia has crossed the Rubicon and you can't go back. That's my reading.
Thank you very much. So yes, I would like to go back to Ukraine and the question of identity. Would you say that there is still a significant divide between the east and the west of Ukraine? And I would like as well to ask you what effect the ongoing conflict since 2014, the annexation of Crimea, had on Ukrainian identity in general.
Yeah, that's a very, very important question. The short answer, and then I'll explain, is that no, there are no more divides. Certainly regarding the existential question as whether Ukraine should be a state, should remain as a state. The bombing of cities, the indiscriminate attack on civilians, we've seen it in the suburbs of Kiev, but we see it in Mariupol, which people may not realize because Mariupol was not very well known, certainly to the world, until a few days ago, a week ago. Certainly not as well known as Odessa, or certainly not Kiev or Lviv. Like, Mariupol is in Donbass. It is a Donbass town. It is a Ukrainian town in terms of the great majority of the population claim a Ukrainian identity. But it is an overwhelming Russian-speaking town in a sense that even though everybody is bilingual and understand Ukrainian language, they can speak it, people are more comfortable speaking Russian. So it is a very Russian-speaking town of Donbass, and it is bombed into submission. And so were smaller towns, not very well known or not known at all, that were on the Ukraine control side of the conflict that has been going on for 8 years. So you had like a line of demarcation de facto between the self-proclaimed republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and the rest of Donbass, which actually was under Ukrainian government control. And two of these towns on the Ukrainian side, named Shastia and Volnovacha, were razed to the ground in the past week, again, through absolutely horrific bombing. These are Donbass towns. So what is my point here? And so is like Kharkiv is not a Donbass town, it's the next province. Kharkiv, right at the Russian border. It's the former capital of Soviet Ukraine in the 1920s, but it is also a city that historically has been massively Russian-speaking, majority Ukrainian, although you have probably 25% of the population who will claim in Russian nationality, which in the context of former Soviet Union means ethnicity, like an ethnic background, like I'm Russian, Ukrainian. And Russia is bombing these cities into submission. So Russia is bombing the part of Ukraine, Eastern Ukraine, Russian-speaking Ukraine, that in Russian representation, suddenly in the Putin worldview, are supposed to belong to what it calls the Russian world, Ruski Mir. And this Ruski Mir is supposed to be fundamentally aligned with Russia, sharing not only culture, language, history, everything. And yet it's bombing them into submission. So what is the result? And already in 2014, was the second part of your question, all these regions, except the core Donbass, declared themselves Ukrainian. They didn't go for the Ruski Mir, like Ukraine was not split in two in 2014. And you actually had politically, first you had street battles and then the local parliaments all declared their allegiance to Ukraine, whether it was Odessa, whether it was Zaporizhia, whether it was Kharkiv. But right now, as I said, this is exactly where the war is going on. The war, we'll see in a couple of weeks, but the war is not waged in Western Ukraine, it's waged in Eastern Ukraine. And what it does, because people on the ground can't understand, why are we bombed? But what it does is to break the multi-century links, very profound links that this population had with Russia, whether in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or since they have family links. And they have a memory also of World War II, and that we all fought the real fascists, not the imaginary fascists of Putin, the real fascists, the Germans, the German Nazis in World War II, that we shared something together. All of that is being extinguished. So in a sense, if you ask me, East and West, well, the East is pounded into submission, but it's the East that's resisting the war. The Ukrainian army is fighting for all of Ukraine, but the war is in Eastern Ukraine. And Putin, in his folly, is basically destroying whatever links, and they were profound. There was also religious links. There's currently, as we speak, a rebellion within the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, because it's a complicated religious situation in Ukraine. You have a church, very important church, that still recognizes the primacy of the patriarch in Moscow, who went on record a few days ago blessing the war. I mean, he's basically blessing the bombing of his own flock. That's the folly that we're facing with. So in terms of identity, there's something very deep happening in Ukraine. The severing of these historic links, making Ukraine not only even more Ukrainian, but to put it crudely, anti-Russian. How can you not be anti-Russian since the Russians of Russia are bombing you for no reason? So this is like the tectonic place, maybe in security matters, but also in identity matters, are now shifting in Ukraine. No matter what happened, we can think of the most gruesome scenarios. Unfortunately, some of the most grim scenarios are plausible in the next weeks and months, but nothing will repair the severing of the bonds between Ukrainians, Eastern, Western, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, and Russia.
Thank you very much. So, well, there's another remarkable fact, because Russia is not only invading Ukraine from Russian soil, they have as well launched parts of their troops from Belarusian soil. So is Belarus already some kind of Russian province? Have they lost their independence, or what would you say?
Maybe the right word is that Belarus and Lukashenko, the eternal dictator of Belarus, has become a vassal, essentially, to use a medieval term, a vassal of the king. And that is, Lukashenko, in his authoritarian regime, kept Russia relatively at bay over, was kind of a complicated relationship he had with Russia over 25 years. He's been around since 1994. So in 2014, during Maidan, when Russia used the threat of military invasion, it did invade, of course, Crimea, but I'm talking about the rest of Ukraine and Donbass. In the early going of the conflict, you had tens of thousands of Russian troops massed at the border, but they couldn't go into Belarus. They didn't. So they were massing along the northeastern border, and they didn't have initially fully Crimea yet, so they couldn't mass at the southern border. What has changed about a year and a half ago is that Lukashenko actually lost the election, and then he stole it. But he faced unprecedented resistance from society. I mean, you had demonstrations, initially massive strikes, and then demonstrations going on for weeks and months and months. And it was extraordinary because Belarus had not exactly been at the forefront of societal mobilization in the last 20 years. And then the Belarusians, or Belarusians, were out, and then they were repressed savagely. Lukashenko needed Russian help to quell basically the resistance, the mobilization. So he brought in, he had to bring in security officers. Even he had to be assisted on the propaganda front, apparently. So a lot of media specialists came in. And in return, essentially, well, in return, he lost his independence. And we see it now. We see it now. He's allowing all these troops, a huge number of them, to not only to set up shop, but to invade, because the initial plan was to take Kiev very rapidly, because the fastest route is from the north going to Chernobyl, actually, from Belarus all the way to Kiev, which normally takes 3 hours, regular car ride. And that's the new situation. Of course, Ukraine de facto lost Crimea. I said de facto, not legally, which allowed the Russian army to attack from the south. And Belarus has de facto lost its sovereignty. The leader, the Belarusian dictator, owing its own stability, since he's an illegitimate ruler, is being propped up essentially to force by Russia. And in return, well, we see the results, that it has become an appendage of Russia. New situation. So that Russia can attack from all positions except from the complete west, because the western border, of course, are EU and NATO states, Poland in particular.
So Putin has declared that he is rejecting Ukrainian statehood, and Russia has as well territorial conflicts with other countries such as Georgia. Which role does Russian nationalism play, and did it develop differently after the breakup of the Soviet Union than in the other new independent states?
There is indeed a parallel between these breakaway states. There's one in Moldova, known as Transnistria, and there was a bloody conflict in the early 90s, and the Russians have a military presence there, and of course the two breakaway territories of Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia, and you had the war in 2008 and the Russian military interventions. I wouldn't call that necessarily Russian nationalism. It's more like Russian maybe imperialism, the ability to seek to weaken post-Soviet states so that eventually they can be broken, a bit unlike what we're seeing in Belarus, and what may be happening in Kazakhstan also. It's not fully clear what happened in Kazakhstan in January, except that eventually you had a Russian military intervention, although Kazakhstan appears to be refusing to join the invasion of Ukraine. So in that sense, the Russian control of these breakaway republics of Ukraine followed that model. The breakaway Donbas republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. But we may remember also that on February 21st, Putin announced the recognition of these breakaway republics, which was on par with the recognition of the breakaway republics of Georgia. And many thought, okay, there is the threat of war, but that will probably be contained to seeking to partition further Ukraine on the model of Georgia, on the model of Moldova. But of course, this is not what happened. It's the full-scale war. And that's where Russian nationalism, or certainly Putin steeped in Russian nationalism, comes in. That is, there is something very, very deep in the Russian-Ukrainian connection, and in particular how Putin sees Ukraine. That's beyond security matters. That's beyond whether Ukraine should or should not join NATO. That's beyond whether NATO should have the right to train the Ukrainian army, which they did for 7 years. We're seeing the results, actually, that was a very good investment from the West, and that included Canada. Canada was part of one of the 4 military missions, because the Ukrainian army is nowhere, I mean, it's total day and night. In 2014, there wasn't much of a Ukrainian army, and we see now this incredible resistance. But when Putin talks about, again, denazification of Ukraine, that Ukraine is conducting a genocide in Donbass, and that those nationalists are fascists, they're bandits, they're corrupt. I mean, it is so out there, hard, even certainly from the outside, to even decipher what it really means, right? But what it really means is that the very idea of Ukrainian nationalism, what is the very idea of Ukrainian nationalism? Or you could say, what is the very idea of any nationalism? I mean, any nationalism can turn very ugly, but just the principle of nationalism, what is the principle of nationalism? It's simply the claim that there is a nation, that we, so the people making the claim, or the people making the claim on behalf of a collective, are distinct, form a nation. It all starts with the claim of distinctiveness. And then because we are a nation, we have the right to determine our own destiny, which is one fundamental way of understanding self-determination. That's not the way international law understands it, obviously, but that's the way nationalists understand it. We exist, we're different, we're not Russians, we're Ukrainians, and therefore Ukrainians should have their own state. That idea has been around since the middle to late 19th century, at a moment when you had the rise of nationalism everywhere in Europe. It was kind of the Germans came up with the idea, in a sense, in the early part of the 19th century, as a reaction to the French Revolution. The French have a different conception of the nation. It starts with the state. And from the beginning, but you had this counter idea in Russia. Well, first of all, you had the development of Russian nationalism, because nationalism is a modern and relatively late construction. So the Russian nationalists started to appear at the same time in late 19th century. But this very resilient idea that Ukrainian nationalism is not real, it's fake, it's foreign induced. And the villains were historically the Austrians, actually in Austro-Hungary. They just created these nationalists in, well, first in the territories that they control, like what is now Western Ukraine used to be part of Austro-Hungary, with the idea of essentially sabotaging, weakening the Russian Empire by creating out of nothing these Ukrainians who are truly Russians or little Russians, belong to the Russian world. And so the villains were the Austrians, then the Poles, and currently the Americans are the villains. And I'm not trying to be facetious. This is literally what Putin, since he's the president, and a whole chorus of Russian nationalists are telling us. Why is it important? Because it links with because now it's literally at the basis of the foundations of the current war, that this is not a real Ukrainian state. Zelensky is not real, he's just a messenger of American interest. That's literally what Putin has been saying for months. And therefore, if it's not real, it has to be, and if it's not real, and these people are really foreign agents, you know, it's pretty pervasive in Russia right now, the whole notion, it's a law, the law on foreign agents, that this is coming from the outside to basically weaken Russia. So the goal of the war is to get rid of the foreign agents. So to denazify, he's using World War II languages, because the nationalists, there was an insurgency in Western Ukraine by an organization that called itself the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and they collaborated with Germans. And why? I mean, they were far-right people, not very nice people, but they were fighting for a territory that had never been part of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. So in that sense, they had no loyalty to Moscow, because Moscow was illegally occupying Western Ukraine. That was the context of the time. What's important to understand is that in the Soviet perception, which then was transposed to the Russian perception and is very fundamental to the Putin worldview, the nationalists are fascist. So the idea of nationalism, that you can have your own Ukrainian state that may determine its destiny differently from Russia, that's fascist, that's Nazi. So that's the meaning of denazification. Let's just extirpate completely, eliminate Ukrainian nationalism. What we see with our own eyes is the complete contrary, because now all Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, whether they're Eastern, Western, Russian-speaking, or Ukrainian-speaking, because their cities are getting bombed. So Putin, with all this carnage, is making Ukraine, or the Ukrainian national identity, as strong as it's ever been. This is where we are.
Thank you very much. So, well, there is a lot of external pressure on Putin due to the Western sanctions, and we have seen as well protests within Russia in many cities. So how stable is Putin's regime? Can he effectively mobilize Russian society for his goals?
Yeah, this is a very important question, and of course we don't know the effect of the sanctions will be so severe on the Russian economy. What would be the social consequences of basically the collapse of the Russian economy months from now? The way it is going, could it lead to riots and to all kinds of protests that the Russian state couldn't contain? We can't exclude that possibility, but the reality is that the Russian regime has become far more authoritarian since Maidan, actually, in the last several years, but now is further, I would use the word radicalizing, to an extent that we haven't seen in Russia since the darkest days of the Soviet Union under Stalin. And I'm referring to the 1930s. This is terrible what's happening in Russia, but the security state that is personally controlled by Putin is not weakening. It's actually getting more and more radical. So we should not what is the word? We should not fool ourselves, perhaps. I don't know if fool is the right word here. Delude, I suppose, delude ourselves in the delusion that indeed there will be so much pressure from below that the regime we can have regime change in Russia. The opposite is happening in front of our eyes. It's further and further radicalization, to the point that even our foreign correspondents are leaving Russia because it's getting too dangerous with these new laws. And this is something that didn't even happen under Stalin. It never happened in the history of the Soviet Union that you have the foreign media, even the foreign media, leaving. So Russia is going into a very, very dark place. The prospect, again, of a change, short of some kind of palace coup, meaning something had happened in 1963, but in 1963, the leadership of the Soviet Union was kind of a collective leadership under the name of the Politburo. You had like the top leader at that time was named Nikita Khrushchev, was the general secretary of the Soviet Union. But he didn't, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that didn't go very well inside the Soviet Union. So he was removed. They removed him. That was the only case in Soviet history when you had basically kind of a collective leadership rebellion here, and they removed him. There's no such mechanism now. The equivalent of the Politburo is called the National Security Council, and we saw with our own eyes 2 weeks ago, because it was televised, how much they are broken. Because it was pretty clear. I mean, he took pleasure even in humiliating some of the council members, particularly the fellow who happens to be the chief of military counterintelligence, pretty serious guy. But it was pretty clear that they were completely taken by surprise about these far-reaching decisions. Putin decided to go to war without consulting anybody, with the likely exception of the top brass of the army, because the army had to be ready to come in. So this is the hard reality, that for now there doesn't seem to be an internal kind of mechanism to make Russia step back.
Thank you. Is there any additional point you would like to make in the context of the war in Ukraine?
I think we pretty much covered what I want to say. I mean, I could go on and on with on the destruction, but in terms of the poor performance of the army, I think you have other experts that can go in great details about how surprised they have been of the lack of performance of the Russian army. But I'm less of the expert here. I can relay what I read, and there seems to have been a great deal of logistical problems and lack of preparedness, really, and that which may make the likelihood of the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian state, withstanding the war a bit higher than it would have been at the beginning of the war. That seems to be the growing consensus. The consensus is not that the Ukrainians will necessarily win, but every single Ukrainian from Ukraine that you're talking to is absolutely convinced that they will win. So that is the spirit. Of course, in battles like this, it's a military balance or imbalance, of course, is a huge factor. But so is the spirit, the morale, the determination, and it's certainly not on the Russian side. We could add also that Ukrainian has been overwhelmingly winning the information war worldwide, outside of Russia, because Russia is kind of a wall now, information wall surrounding, is basically on the narrative of the war. So the extent to which Putin will be able to sustain his narrative domestically remains to be seen, but he's losing internationally. There's absolutely no question about that. And President Zelensky is certainly an important factor in this very significant dimension of any war. You know, you've got the military aspect, the economic aspect, but you've got also the narrative aspect, and the Ukrainians are coming out strongly.
So, thank you very much for being here today, Professor Arel, and
My pleasure.
thank you for sharing your point of view.
Thank you.